Case 1. Megan Huntsman between 1996 and 2006 4th District Court, Utah County, Utah. There are secrets that neighborhoods carry for years without knowing they are carrying them at all. The kind that live behind ordinary doors, beneath ordinary rooflines, in garages that look just like every other garage on the street. Pleasant Grove, Utah sits roughly 30 miles south of Salt Lake City in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains, a quiet, faith-centered community where neighbors wave from driveways and children ride bicycles on safe cul-de-sacs. For nearly 2 decades, one house on a residential street in that city held a secret so devastating that when it finally surfaced in the spring of 2014, investigators and community members alike struggled to find language adequate enough to describe what had been hidden there. The woman at the center of that secret was Megan Huntsman. Born in 1972, Huntsman was a mother, a daughter, a neighbor. She had lived in Pleasant Grove for the better part of her adult life. She had a marriage, a household, a daily routine that, from the outside, appeared unremarkable. She was, by most accounts of those who knew her casually, a quiet and largely private person. Nothing about the exterior of her life announced what court records would eventually confirm had been occurring inside it across a span of 10 years. Between the years 1996 and 2006, according to prosecutors and the detailed findings entered into the court record, Megan Huntsman gave birth to 7 infants inside her home. 6 of those infants, investigators determined, did not survive. Not because of natural causes or medical emergencies. Not because of accidents or complications beyond any mother's control. According to the charges to which Huntsman ultimately pleaded guilty, each of those 6 newborns was deliberately caused to perish in the moments immediately following their delivery. Their remains were then concealed, placed into cardboard boxes and stored inside the garage of the family home, where they remained, hidden and undiscovered, for years. The 7th infant, investigators found, appeared to have been stillborn, a distinction that would be carefully parsed during the legal proceedings that followed, and one that matters deeply to the integrity and accuracy of how this case is told. For a full decade after the final incident documented in the court record, the family's life continued. Huntsman's estranged husband, Douglas Lovell, a name that would itself carry significant legal weight in Utah courts for entirely separate reasons, had been serving a prison sentence and was largely absent from the household. The children who had survived, who had grown up in that home, had no knowledge of what the garage contained. The neighborhood had no knowledge. The city had no knowledge. Then came the spring of 2014. On April 12, 2014, Douglas Lovell returned to the Pleasant Grove property. He was there to clean out the garage, a practical task, the kind undertaken when a property is being cleared or prepared. What he found inside that garage, the cardboard boxes, the remains within them, transformed an ordinary afternoon into the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Utah's modern history. Law enforcement responded. The Utah County Sheriff's Office took charge of the scene. Medical examiners were called in. Investigators worked carefully and methodically through the contents of the garage, documenting what they found with the clinical precision that such cases demand and deserve. The findings confirmed what the initial discovery had suggested: the remains of multiple infants, concealed over what appeared to be a period spanning multiple years. Megan Huntsman was taken into custody. The charges brought against her reflected the gravity of what the evidence showed. 6 counts of homicide were filed, one for each of the infants whose deaths investigators determined had not been the result of natural causes. The investigation was painstaking. Each set of remains required individual examination by forensic specialists. The timeline had to be reconstructed carefully, drawing on physical evidence, medical analysis, and the accounts of those with knowledge of the household's history during the relevant years. What investigators and prosecutors grappled with, and what community members, family counselors, and criminal justice professionals across the country would discuss in the months and years that followed, was the question of how something of this magnitude could remain concealed for so long. The answer, such as it is, lies in the nature of prolonged concealment itself. There were no missing persons reports for these infants because their existence had never been publicly acknowledged. There were no neighbors who had noticed unusual activity because the events had occurred entirely within the privacy of the home. There was no paper trail connecting birth to death because no birth had ever been registered. In many ways, the investigation into Megan Huntsman's case became a case study in the invisible nature of crimes that occur entirely within the domestic sphere, crimes that leave no external witnesses, generate no public records, and depend entirely on concealment for their longevity. Huntsman cooperated with investigators to a meaningful degree. She provided information that assisted the inquiry. In September of 2014, she entered guilty pleas to 6 counts of first-degree felony murder in 4th District Court in Utah County. The plea spared the surviving members of her family, her daughters, who had grown up in that home, the ordeal of a full trial during which the details of what had occurred would have been presented in open court. In April of 2015, Megan Huntsman appeared for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with grief, with questions, with the weight of an outcome that no legal proceeding could ever fully resolve. The judge sentenced her to up to life in prison, 1 sentence per count, the terms to be served concurrently. She was committed to the Utah State Correctional Facility, where she remains as of the time this documentary was produced. The case prompted significant conversation across Utah and nationally about prenatal mental health support, the isolation that can surround domestic life, and the systemic gaps that allow crises of this magnitude to go undetected across years and even decades. Advocates for maternal mental health pointed to the Huntsman case as evidence of how profoundly inadequate support structures can be for women in crisis, a point that does not diminish accountability, but does underscore the importance of intervention systems that might, in other circumstances, interrupt a tragedy before it compounds. The children Megan Huntsman raised, the daughters who survived, who grew up without knowledge of what the garage held, were themselves victims of the circumstances that shaped their family's history. Their lives were upended by the discovery in April 2014 in ways that no sentencing could address or repair. Support services, family advocacy organizations, and grief counselors played important roles in the aftermath for those left to navigate what had been uncovered. For the 6 infants who never received names in any public record, who never had a birth registered or a life acknowledged, the criminal proceeding represented the first and only formal recognition of their existence. In a justice system built around the identification and prosecution of wrongdoing, their cases stand as a reminder that the law's reach is only as far as discovery allows, and that the most devastating harms are sometimes those that remain entirely out of sight until chance or circumstance brings them into the light. The Huntsman case remains one of the most significant criminal matters in Utah County's history. It is studied in criminal justice programs, referenced in discussions of domestic crime, maternal mental health, and the limitations of residential privacy norms. It is a case that resists easy framing because no single lens, legal, psychological, social, captures its full complexity. What the record shows, stripped to its documented facts, is a decade-long concealment of profound harm carried out in silence within an ordinary home in a community that had no reason to look for what was hidden there. Justice, when it came through a guilty plea rather than a verdict. It came through a sentence rather than a public accounting of every detail. For many in the community, and for victim advocates who followed the case, that outcome raised as many questions as it settled. But the formal acknowledgement of what had occurred, the entry of those 6 counts into the court record, the sentence that followed, these represented the only form of institutional reckoning available. Megan Huntsman will be eligible for parole review proceedings in the years ahead. Whether she will ever walk free is a question that the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole will address in its own time and according to its own processes. What is not in question, and what the court record makes permanently clear, is what occurred in that garage in Pleasant Grove across the span of a decade, and what it cost. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis related to pregnancy, postpartum experiences, or domestic isolation, the Postpartum Support International Helpline is available at 1-800-944-4773. Help is available, and reaching out is always the right choice. If this case has moved you, if it has made you think about the invisible crises that exist behind closed doors in communities just like yours, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps this work going and ensures that these stories are told with the care and seriousness they deserve. Case 2, Ruby Franke uncovered August 30, 2023 5th District Court, Washington County, Utah. There is a particular kind of trust that audiences extend to public figures who build their platforms around family life. It is a trust rooted in visibility, the sense that because a family's daily existence is being broadcast, observed, and commented upon by hundreds of thousands of people, the welfare of the children within that family must be, at some level, verified by the mere fact of the audience's presence. Viewers become, in a sense, involuntary witnesses to the domestic world being presented to them. And yet, as the criminal case against Ruby Franke demonstrated with shattering clarity, visibility and transparency are not the same thing. An audience of millions can watch a family's curated presentation for years and never see what is actually happening inside the home. Ruby Franke was, by the metrics of the social media landscape, a success. Her YouTube channel, titled 8 Passengers, documented the daily life of her husband Kevin Franke and their 6 children. At its peak, the channel attracted approximately 2 million subscribers. The content was family-oriented, faith-centered, and presented the Frankes as a household navigating the everyday challenges of raising a large family. Homework struggles, sibling conflicts, household routines, and the occasional family adventure. Franke herself appeared confident, articulate, and purposeful on camera. She presented her parenting philosophy with conviction. She was, to her audience, a relatable and aspirational figure. Behind that presentation, prosecutors would eventually argue, a profoundly different reality was taking shape. The public face of the Franke family began showing cracks as early as 2021, when one of her sons appeared in a family video appearing notably thin and expressing distress. Online commenters flagged the footage with concern. Child Protective Services in Utah received calls. Investigations were opened. And then, as sometimes happens in cases where abuse occurs within a private domestic environment that has learned to present well to outside observers, the inquiries did not result in immediate intervention. The children remained in the home. The channel continued. In the period that followed, Ruby Franke became professionally and personally aligned with Jody Hildebrandt, a family counselor based in Washington County, Utah, who operated a wellness and counseling business called Connections. Hildebrandt's approach, critics and investigators would later note, involved ideologies that framed a range of childhood behaviors as spiritual failures requiring correction. The alignment between Franke's parenting philosophy and Hildebrandt's counseling framework would become a central element of the criminal investigation that followed. By the summer of 2023, 2 of the Franke children had been separated from the family home and were living with Jody Hildebrandt at her property in Ivins, in Washington County, roughly 300 miles south of Salt Lake City. What was happening within that property, during the period that preceded law enforcement's involvement, forms the documented core of the criminal case. On August 30th, 2023, a 12-year-old boy, Ruby Franke's son, appeared at the home of a neighbor near Hildebrandt's property. He was, by the description of those who encountered him that day, in an alarming physical state. He was thin to a degree that immediately concerned those who saw him. He had physical injuries on his body. He asked for food and water. He told the neighbor what had been happening. Law enforcement responded within hours. Officers arrived at Hildebrandt's property and at the family's home. What they found during those searches was documented extensively in the probable cause affidavits and court filings that became part of the public record. A second child, an 8-year-old girl, Franke's youngest daughter, was also found to be in serious physical distress. The specific findings documented by investigators and entered into the court record described conditions that reflected sustained, severe deprivation and physical harm. Prosecutors detailed restraints, starvation, and injuries consistent with prolonged maltreatment. Medical professionals who examined the children found evidence of harm that investigators stated had occurred over an extended period, not days or weeks, but months. Both Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt were arrested on August 30th, 2023. Each faced multiple serious felony charges. The cases proceeded through Utah's 5th District Court in Washington County. Franke retained legal counsel. As the weeks and months passed, and the full weight of the evidence was disclosed to the defense, negotiations occurred. On the morning of December 18, 2023, Ruby Franke appeared in court and entered guilty pleas to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. 1 count for each of the 2 children who had been in Hildebrandt's care, with 2 counts per child reflecting the severity classification of the documented harm. Hildebrandt entered similar pleas on the same day. In February of 2024, both women appeared for sentencing. Judge John David Walton addressed the courtroom with language that reflected the gravity of what the evidence had established. Ruby Franke was sentenced to serve 4 consecutive terms of 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Correctional Facility. Consecutive, meaning each term would begin only after the preceding one had been fully served. The structure of that sentence reflected the court's determination that the crimes involving each child were separate and serious matters warranting separate accountability. Hildebrandt received an equivalent sentence. The Franke case generated national conversation on multiple levels simultaneously. It raised questions about the responsibility of social media platforms to monitor the welfare of children who appear in monetized content. It prompted discussion of how religious and philosophical frameworks can be weaponized to justify harm, and of how wellness and counseling spaces can become environments in which damaging ideologies take hold without adequate professional oversight. It reignited debate about the adequacy of Utah's Child Protective Services response in the years before the August 2023 intervention, a debate that state officials and child welfare advocates engaged with seriously in the months that followed. The surviving members of the Franke family, Kevin Franke, who had separated from Ruby prior to the arrests, and the 4 children who had not been in Hildebrandt's care, faced an aftermath of profound disruption. Kevin Franke publicly expressed both grief over what his children had endured and clear condemnation of the actions that had been taken. The children involved in the criminal case received ongoing therapeutic support. Child welfare advocates underscored the importance of trauma-informed care for all 6 children as they worked to rebuild their lives. For the community of viewers who had followed 8 passengers for years, who had watched these children grow up, who had commented on their videos, who had in some cases sent gifts, letters, and expressions of support, the revelations of August 2023 produced a profound reckoning with the nature of parasocial relationships and the limitations of what any audience can actually know about the private lives they are being invited to observe. The channel had been removed from YouTube before the arrests. Its legacy, however, remained in the form of hundreds of archived videos, academic discussions about the ethics of family content creation, and the lived experiences of 2 children whose suffering had, in a devastating irony, gone largely undetected precisely because their family was among the most publicly visible on the platform. Ruby Franke is currently serving her sentence at the Utah State Correctional Facility. Jody Hildebrandt is serving her sentence at the same institution. Neither is eligible for release in the near term. The children whose welfare was placed at the center of this case are, by all available reporting, receiving the support and care that the courts, child welfare professionals, and their family determined was appropriate. The case stands as one of the most high-profile criminal matters involving a social media personality in Utah's history, and as a reminder that accountability, when it finally arrives, can come swiftly even after years of concealment, provided that one child finds the courage and the opportunity to walk to a neighbor's door and ask for help. If you are concerned about the welfare of a child in your community, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-422-4453. Every call is confidential, and every concern is worth reporting. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. It truly makes a difference and helps us continue telling these important stories. Case 3, Kouri Richins, March 3, 2022, 3rd District Court, Summit County, Utah. There are crimes that announce themselves through chaos and disruption. Scenes that neighbors remember, that emergency responders discuss for years, that leave visible marks on the places where they occurred. And then there are crimes of a quieter and, in some ways, more chilling nature. Crimes that occur in the space of an ordinary evening, in the privacy of a private residence, without witnesses, without struggle, without the external signs that might prompt intervention or inquiry. The case of Kouri Richins belongs to the second category. What happened on the night of March 3, 2022, in the Richins family home in Camas, in Summit County, Utah, appeared at first to be a private tragedy. A husband gone too soon, a widow left to raise her children, a family beginning the slow and difficult work of grief. What investigators would eventually conclude was something far more deliberate. Eric Richins was 39 years old when he passed away on March 3, 2022. He and Kouri had been married for several years. They had 3 young children together. They lived in Camas, a small mountain community in Summit County approximately 60 miles east of Salt Lake City. By external appearances, they were a family with the markers of prosperity, a comfortable home, a lifestyle that suggested financial stability, a social presence that seemed relatively ordinary. The relationship between Eric and Kouri Richins had not, according to the evidence that would emerge during the investigation, been without serious tension. Financial disputes, disagreements over property, questions about the management of assets. These elements formed a backdrop to the household's daily life that would take on enormous legal significance in the months following Eric's passing. On the night of March 3, Kouri Richins told first responders and, subsequently, investigators that her husband had consumed a celebratory cocktail, a drink she had prepared for him, during the course of the evening. Some hours later, Eric Richins was found unresponsive. Emergency medical personnel were summoned. Despite their efforts, he did not survive. His passing was initially treated as a medical event, a sudden and tragic health emergency of the kind that, though devastating, does occur. A toxicological examination, however, told a different story. The results of that examination, which were obtained and reviewed as part of the investigation into Eric Richins' death, documented the presence of fentanyl in his system and not in a trace amount. The quantity detected was, according to prosecutors, approximately 5 times the dose considered sufficient to cause death in a person without a significant tolerance to opioids. Eric Richins had not been known to use opioids. There was no legitimate prescription in his name for any such substance. The presence of fentanyl in the quantities documented by the toxicology report, investigators concluded, was not consistent with accidental or recreational exposure. It was consistent with deliberate administration. The investigation that followed was painstaking and methodical. Detectives from the Summit County Sheriff's Office worked the case across the months that followed Eric's passing, building their evidentiary foundation carefully before any arrest was made. During this period, Kouri Richins continued to present herself publicly as a grieving widow. She spoke of her loss. She memorialized her husband. She made financial and legal decisions related to the estate. And then she wrote a book. In the year following Eric's death, Kouri Richins authored and self-published a children's book about grief titled Are You With Me? The book, framed as a story about coping with the loss of a loved one, was ostensibly inspired by, and dedicated to, her late husband. It was a detail that, when it became public knowledge following her arrest, struck many observers as one of the most arresting and disturbing elements of an already deeply troubling case. The woman investigators suspected of administering a lethal dose of a controlled substance to her husband had, in the interim, written a children's book about his death. On May 8, 2023, Kouri Richins was arrested. The charges brought against her were among the most serious available under Utah law. First-degree felony, aggravated murder. The aggravated designation reflected the alleged use of a poison or controlled substance as the instrument of the crime, a factor that, under Utah's criminal statutes, elevates a homicide charge and carries significantly enhanced potential penalties, including, under certain circumstances, the possibility of the death penalty. The arrest triggered enormous national media coverage. The children's book became a symbol of the case's particular disturbing character, the juxtaposition of a public grief narrative with the allegations of deliberate, calculated wrongdoing. Publishers and retailers pulled the book from circulation. Legal analysts discussed the implications of the charges. Victim advocates spoke carefully about the 3 children at the center of the case. Eric's children, now navigating a reality in which their mother had been charged with their father's death. The criminal case proceeded through 3rd District Court in Summit County. Kouri Richins entered a not guilty plea and retained legal counsel. Pretrial proceedings involved extensive litigation over evidence, discovery, and the admissibility of various categories of information. As of the most recent information available to this production, the case has continued through the court process, with Richins maintaining her not guilty position. The legal proceedings involve the kind of forensic and circumstantial evidence that serious homicide cases in Utah typically require. The toxicology findings, communications records, financial documentation, witness testimony regarding the state of the marriage and the events surrounding Eric's passing, and the chain of custody for the substance investigators allege was administered. The complexity of the evidentiary picture is, in part, a function of the nature of the alleged crime itself, one that left no witnesses, no visible scene of struggle, and that initially appeared to fall within the natural range of medical events. Eric Richins' family, his parents, his siblings, those who knew him and mourned his passing, have participated in the public proceedings to the degree that the process allows. They have spoken publicly about their loss, their love for Eric, and their confidence in the legal process. Their grief is both personal and public in the way that grief in high-profile criminal cases always becomes. The three children at the center of this case, who were young at the time of their father's passing and younger still, in any meaningful understanding of what the adult world surrounding them had contained, are being cared for by family members during the pendency of the criminal proceedings. The case of Kouri Richins is, at its core, a case about what occurs beneath the surface of lives that appear, from the outside, to be unremarkable. It is a case about the particular vulnerability that exists within intimate relationships, the trust that partners extend to one another in private moments, the degree to which that trust can be exploited by someone who has decided that the partnership's continuation is less valuable than its termination. It is also a case about the forensic science that makes accountability possible even in the absence of witnesses, the capacity of toxicological analysis to document what no person observed, to establish what no one saw, and to provide the foundation for a criminal proceeding that might otherwise never have been possible. Accountability, when it arrives in cases of this nature, arrives through science, through investigation, and through the patient work of detectives who declined to accept a natural explanation when the evidence pointed toward a different conclusion. Whether that accountability results in a conviction in this particular case is a question for the jury and the courts. But the investigation itself, the decision to look more carefully, to test more thoroughly, to ask harder questions, represents exactly the kind of institutional diligence that serves justice. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. If you're new here, welcome, and thank you for watching. Case 4, Brittanie Mae Miloshevsky, June 7, 2023 District Court, Salt Lake County, Utah. Every child who is placed into a vehicle trusts, in the wordless and absolute way that small children trust the adults who care for them, that the person behind the wheel will bring them safely to wherever they are going. That trust is so fundamental, so ingrained in the architecture of the parent-child relationship, that it rarely requires articulation. It simply exists, the assumption of safe passage, the confidence that the world outside the car window will remain exactly that, outside. What happened in South Salt Lake on the afternoon of June 7, 2020, shattered that trust in the most catastrophic and irreversible way imaginable. Brittanie Mae Miloshevsky was behind the wheel of a minivan on that afternoon. In the vehicle with her was her 18-month-old son, properly secured in his car seat, a small detail that, in the events that followed, would take on both legal and deeply human significance. The child had done everything right. He was strapped in. He was where he was supposed to be. The failure that afternoon was entirely the adults. Miloshevsky, according to the investigation conducted by South Salt Lake Police and the evidentiary record compiled in the criminal case that followed, was heavily intoxicated at the time she was driving. The vehicle, a minivan, the kind associated in the cultural imagination with family outings and school pickups and grocery runs, traveled through the property of a business called Golf the Round, a golf course in South Salt Lake. The vehicle did not stop. It did not navigate the property carefully. It traveled across the grounds, and then, at the edge of that property, it entered a retention pond. A retention pond is not a dramatic body of water. It is not a river or a lake. It is a shallow, utilitarian feature of commercial and residential landscaping, a catch basin, a drainage solution, a feature so unremarkable in the built environment that it rarely draws a second glance. But when a vehicle enters a retention pond, when a child strapped into a car seat is suddenly submerged in the water filling the footwell and rising toward the headrests, the size and ordinaries of that body of water become entirely irrelevant. First responders arrived at the scene. They entered the water. They located the vehicle. They found the 18-month-old boy, still strapped into his car seat, submerged. They pulled him from the vehicle. They worked to stabilize him. He was transported to a medical facility where a team of professionals did everything available to medicine to support his recovery. He did not survive. The injuries he sustained as a result of being submerged in that vehicle proved fatal. A child who had been alive and healthy at the start of that afternoon, whose only context for the day was whatever a toddler's understanding of the world provides, the comfort of a familiar voice, the security of a car seat, the ordinary experience of going somewhere with a parent, did not come home. Miloshevsky was charged with child abuse homicide and driving under the influence. The charges reflected both the catastrophic outcome of that afternoon and the specific factor that investigators determined had caused it, her level of intoxication at the time of the crash. The case proceeded through 3rd District Court in Salt Lake County. The evidentiary record included the toxicological findings from Miloshevsky's blood draw following the crash, the investigative documentation of the scene, the medical records pertaining to the child's injuries and eventual passing, and witness accounts from those who had been present in the vicinity of the Gulf-the-Round property. The legal proceedings that followed involved the careful application of Utah's child abuse homicide statute, a provision of law that reflects the legislature's determination that causing the death of a child through reckless or criminally negligent conduct warrants the most serious criminal accountability. The charge is not reserved for cases involving deliberate intent to cause harm. It encompasses exactly the kind of case that Miloshevsky's represents, a case in which the decision to drive while heavily impaired, a decision made before the vehicle was started, before the child was placed in his car seat, before the journey began, set in motion a chain of events whose catastrophic conclusion became inevitable the moment the car moved. South Salt Lake is a community within Salt Lake County, a densely populated urban area that encompasses dozens of municipalities in the shadow of the Wasatch Mountains. It is, in many respects, indistinguishable at the street level from the wider Salt Lake metropolitan area. The same commercial corridors, the same residential neighborhoods, the same everyday landscape of a Western American city. The Gulf-the-Round property was an ordinary feature of that landscape. The retention pond at its edge was an ordinary feature of that property. Nothing about the geography of that afternoon was unusual until a minivan entered the water and a child's life was placed in immediate danger. Miloshevsky's case is one of a significant number of child fatality cases in Utah and across the United States that involve driving under the influence. It is a category of case that law enforcement agencies, public health advocates, and child welfare organizations have consistently identified as one of the most preventable categories of child harm. Preventable because the decision that creates the risk occurs before the vehicle is ever in motion. In the moment when an impaired adult chooses to drive rather than finding another means of transportation or another caregiver for the child in their care. That preventability is not a legal argument. It is a moral one. And it is one that victim advocates, prosecutors, and community safety organizations have returned to repeatedly in the years since June 7, 2020. Not to compound the legal accountability that the court process provides, but to underscore the importance of the choices made before catastrophes occur, in the ordinary moments that precede extraordinary tragedies. The accountability this case produced through the court system represents the recognition by the legal framework that a child's life, ended in circumstances like these, demands a formal response. That response does not restore what was lost. It never can. But it establishes a record, affirms a standard, and ensures that the child whose life ended in a retention pond in South Salt Lake on a June afternoon in 2020 is acknowledged by the institutions of justice as someone whose passing mattered and whose loss demands an accounting. Thank you for watching. If this case resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We cover these cases because the victims deserve to be remembered. Case 5, Nicole Lester, December 31st. 2019 3rd District Court, Salt Lake County, Utah. There are cases in the criminal record that defy the frameworks we typically apply to understand why harm occurs. Cases that do not fit neatly into the categories of impulse or planning, of breakdown or calculation, of circumstances that, however terrible, can be traced through a comprehensible sequence of cause and effect. The events of New Year's Eve, 2019, in West Valley City, Utah, belong to this category. What Nicole Lester did on the last night of that year, what she subsequently told her neighbors, what responding officers found when they arrived at the residence, presented investigators, prosecutors, mental health professionals, and the community with a case whose facts resist the consolation of easy explanation. West Valley City sits within Salt Lake County, immediately west of Salt Lake City proper. It is the second most populous city in Utah, a densely urban community of broad commercial corridors, diverse neighborhoods, and a residential landscape that mixes apartment complexes with single-family homes. On the night of December 31st, 2019, as the rest of the country was marking the transition from one year to the next, the community around one West Valley City address was about to be drawn into events that no calendar transition could frame or contain. Lainey Voss was 4 years old. She was Nicole Lester's daughter. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a child full of the energy and presence that 4-year-olds carry with them everywhere they go. A child who had not yet reached kindergarten, who was still at the age when the world is largely a function of the people immediately around her, the adults who feed and dress and speak to her and constitute the entirety of her known universe. On the night of December 31st, Nicole Lester left her home and walked to a neighbor's residence. She knocked on the door. When the neighbor answered, she told them what had happened inside the house. The neighbor called 911. Responding officers arrived at Nicole Lester's home. They entered. In the basement of the residence, they found Lainey Voss. The 4-year-old had sustained severe injuries consistent with what prosecutors would describe in court documents as sharp force trauma. She had not survived. Nicole Lester was taken into custody. She was charged with homicide. The case entered the 3rd District Court system in Salt Lake County, where it would proceed through the full weight of the criminal justice process over the following years. What the investigation into the events of that night revealed, and what the criminal proceedings that followed attempted to address, raised profound questions about mental health, about crisis intervention, about the systems that exist and those that do not exist to support families in acute distress. Investigators and mental health professionals involved in the case documented a picture of a household under significant psychological strain. The precise nature of that strain, the specific factors that contributed to what occurred on the night of December 31st, were examined carefully in the legal proceedings that followed. Nicole Lester's defense, in the course of the criminal case, raised questions about her mental state at the time of the offense. These questions were assessed by mental health professionals appointed by the court to conduct competency and sanity evaluations. Their findings fed into the legal process that ultimately concluded with Lester's guilty plea. In August of 2022, Nicole Lester appeared in 3rd District Court in Salt Lake County and entered a guilty plea to the charge of homicide. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in the Utah State Correctional Facility. The sentence reflected the court's determination that the gravity of what had occurred on New Year's Eve 2019 warranted a significant and enduring period of incarceration. For the community of West Valley City, for the neighbors who had answered the door that night, for the first responders who had entered the house, for the family members who had loved Lainey Voss and who now carried the weight of her absence, the sentencing in August 2022 provided the formal legal conclusion that the process requires. It did not, and could not, address the absence itself. Lainey Voss would have been nearly 7 years old at the time of her mother's sentencing. She would have been approaching the end of her 1st grade year, navigating the early social architecture of elementary school, developing the personality and preferences and quirks that would have defined her as a person across the years of a life she did not get to live. The case drew attention in Utah's criminal justice and public health communities to the importance of crisis intervention resources, particularly for families experiencing acute mental health crises in residential settings. Mental health advocates pointed to the Lester case as an example of a scenario in which earlier intervention might have altered a trajectory that ended in irreversible harm. That advocacy is not directed at diminishing accountability. Lester's guilty plea and sentence represent the legal acknowledgement of her responsibility for what occurred. Rather, it reflects the broader commitment to building the kind of support infrastructure that might, in another household on another night, interrupt a crisis before it becomes a catastrophe. For Lainey Voss, the formal record of this case is the only institutional acknowledgement of what she lost. The criminal proceeding, the guilty plea, the sentence. These are the mechanisms through which the legal system recognizes that her life mattered, that what happened to her was wrong, and that the person responsible has been held accountable under the law. The National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline is available at 1-800-950-NAMI. That is 1-800-950-6264. If you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis, please reach out. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Sharing this content helps us continue honoring the memory of victims like Lainey Voss. Case 6. Reyna Elizabeth Flores-Rosales abuse culminating in death on February 25, 2019 3rd District Court, Salt Lake County, Utah. Primary Children's Hospital sits in Salt Lake City at the base of the Wasatch Mountains, a place that families across Utah and the Intermountain West associate with the most serious pediatric medical care available in the region. It is a place where children arrive in crisis and, in many cases, are given the chance they need. It is also a place where medical professionals, by the nature of their work and the populations they serve, are trained to recognize when the injuries presenting before them are not the result of accidents or illnesses, but of something darker and more deliberate. It was at Primary Children's Hospital that the case of 6-year-old Norlin Cruz reached its devastating conclusion, and it was there that the chain of events was set in motion that would result in the criminal prosecution of his mother, Reyna Elizabeth Flores-Rosales. Norlin Cruz arrived at Primary Children's Hospital in February of 2019. He was 6 years old. The injuries documented by the medical professionals who examined him upon his arrival were, according to the court records that would later describe them, catastrophic. They were not consistent with any single accident. They were not consistent with a fall, a collision, an isolated traumatic event of the kind that ordinary childhood activity sometimes produces. What the examining physicians documented was a pattern, the kind of pattern that pediatric trauma specialists and child abuse investigators recognize as the signature of sustained, non-accidental harm. The specific findings entered into the court record included deep burns, widespread bruising across multiple areas of the body, and severe head trauma. Each of these injury categories told investigators something. The burns indicated exposure to a heat source under conditions that a child cannot protect himself from. The widespread bruising indicated repeated, forceful physical contact across a substantial period of time. The head trauma indicated impact of a severity that no accident of ordinary childhood life produces. Norlin Cruz did not survive his injuries. He passed away on February 25, 2019. He was 6 years old. He had not yet reached the age at which Utah children enter the first grade. Reyna Elizabeth Flores-Rosales, his mother, was arrested in connection with his death. She was charged with aggravated child abuse homicide, a charge that reflects both the nature of the harm inflicted and its fatal outcome. The case entered the criminal justice system in Salt Lake County, where it would be processed through 3rd District Court. The investigation that supported the prosecution involved the medical documentation from Primary Children's Hospital, the findings of forensic specialists who examined Norlin's injuries in detail, and the investigative work of law enforcement agencies responsible for child welfare cases in Sandy and the broader Salt Lake County area. Sandy is a city within Salt Lake County, positioned to the south of Salt Lake City proper, a suburban community of residential neighborhoods and commercial corridors that gives no external sign of the private horrors that can occur within its residential spaces. The evidentiary picture built by prosecutors was one of sustained harm that had not occurred on a single occasion, but that had accumulated over a period of time significant enough to produce the pattern of injuries that physicians documented. This pattern is what investigators and prosecutors consistently point to in cases like Norlin's as the distinction between accident and abuse. Not a single catastrophic event, but a series of events whose cumulative effect is written onto a child's body in ways that medicine can read with clarity. Flores-Rosales proceeded through the court process. The evidence against her was evaluated by the court, and she was ultimately convicted of aggravated child abuse homicide. The 3rd District Court sentenced her to a term of 5 years to life in the Utah State Correctional Facility. The sentence reflected the court's acknowledgement of both the severity of the harm Norlin had endured and the ultimately fatal nature of that harm. 5 years to life is, by the structure of Utah's sentencing framework, a term that encompasses a significant range of potential outcomes. The minimum term establishes the earliest date at which parole eligibility can be considered. The life component establishes that incarceration can, in the determination of the Board of Pardons and Parole, extend indefinitely if the circumstances warrant. Whether Flores-Rosales will serve the minimum or the maximum of that range is a question that the parole process will eventually address. For Norland Cruz, the sentencing framework and the parole process are abstractions. He was 6 years old. He had, by every indication available in the public record, a childhood that should have been ordinary, the routines of home and school and neighborhood, the small landmarks of a young life that are invisible to everyone except the child living them. What he experienced in the period before his death at Primary Children's Hospital, and what ended his life on February 25, 2019, represents the most profound failure of the adult world that was responsible for his care and protection. The case of Norland Cruz is one that child welfare advocates in Utah have returned to repeatedly in discussions about early intervention, mandatory reporting, and the systems that exist, or that need to be strengthened, to identify children who are experiencing sustained harm within their homes before that harm reaches a fatal threshold. His case is studied in child protection training programs. His name appears in legislative discussions about child welfare reform. The harm he endured has, in the way that the harm of individual children sometimes does, contributed to broader systemic conversations about how communities protect their most vulnerable members. That is not consolation. It is not redemption. It is simply what happens when a tragedy is serious enough to force the institutions around it to examine themselves. Norland Cruz deserved protection before February of 2019. The accountability that came after his passing cannot give him what he deserved. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is available around the clock. If you see something, please say something. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support helps us tell these stories and advocate for the children who can no longer speak for themselves. Case 7. Ashlee Buzzard, October 9, 2025, Santa Barbara County Superior Court, California. There are cases that cross jurisdictional lines in ways that complicate every legal, investigative, and institutional framework designed to respond to them. Cases whose geography is part of their character, whose multi-state dimensions create the kind of procedural complexity that tests the coordination capacities of multiple law enforcement agencies simultaneously. The case of Ashlee Buzzard and her 9-year-old daughter Melody is one such case. It begins in California, passes through Colorado, ends in a remote corridor of Utah's canyon country, and concludes, at least in terms of the initial legal proceedings, in a California courtroom. Understanding it requires following it across each of those geographies, because the geography itself is part of the evidence. Ashlee Buzzard lived in Santa Barbara County, California. She had a daughter named Melody, who was 9 years old. Whatever the private circumstances of their household, whatever the internal dynamics of their relationship and their daily life together, what the investigation would eventually establish was that at some point in the period preceding October of 2025, a decision had been made. That decision, and the premeditation that investigators traced to Buzzard's California residence, would become the jurisdictional anchor for the criminal case that ultimately followed. In early October of 2025, Ashlee Buzzard and Melody left California together. They traveled east. The journey took them through multiple states. To anyone observing them, at a gas station, a rest stop, a roadside diner, they would have appeared to be a mother and daughter on a road trip. The ordinary appearance of their travel was, according to investigators, a function of exactly the kind of deliberate and calculated planning that would later become central to the prosecution's theory of the case. On October 9, 2025, in the area near the border between Colorado and Utah, a landscape of high desert and canyon country, remote and sparsely populated, far from the residential and commercial environments where the ordinary infrastructure of witness and observation exists, Melody Buzzard lost her life. She was 9 years old. The manner of her passing, as documented in the court filings that entered the public record, was not accidental. It was not a medical emergency. According to the charges brought against her mother, it was deliberate. For weeks after October 9, 2025, Melody's fate was unknown to anyone outside of whatever her mother had done and wherever her mother had gone afterward. The remote canyon corridor near the Colorado-Utah border holds its secrets well. The landscape there is vast, the roads are infrequent, and the human presence is sparse. A child's remains, in such an environment, can remain undiscovered for a very long time. It was not until December 6, 2025, that passers-by traveling along State Route 24 in Wayne County, Utah, made the discovery that brought Melody's case into the formal channels of law enforcement. The remains they found off the road that day were, by December, in a condition that reflected weeks of exposure in the Utah Canyon country. Investigators responded. The location was documented. The painstaking work of identification began. Wayne County, Utah, is among the most remote and sparsely populated counties in a state with several such counties. State Route 24 cuts through canyon and desert landscape of stunning and austere beauty, the kind of landscape that draws hikers, photographers, and outdoor enthusiasts, and that is simultaneously the kind of landscape in which terrible things can be hidden for a long time. The passers-by who found Melody's remains on that December day provided the essential first link in the chain that eventually connected what had been found in Wayne County to Ashlee Buzzard in California. Law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions coordinated in the investigation that followed. The identification of the remains, once accomplished, established the connection to the missing 9-year-old from California. The investigation traced the route that Buzzard and Melody had traveled, reconstructed the timeline of their journey, and built the evidentiary picture that supported the arrest. Because investigators determined that the premeditation for the crime had occurred at Buzzard's residence in Santa Barbara County, California, the case was designated for prosecution in California rather than in Utah or Colorado. Buzzard was located, arrested, and extradited to Santa Barbara County, where she was booked into custody and charged with first-degree murder. In the initial court proceedings in Santa Barbara County Superior Court, Ashlee Buzzard entered a plea of not guilty to the first-degree murder charge. Her case was scheduled to proceed through the California court system. As of the most recent information available to this production, the matter has continued through pretrial proceedings. The case of Melody Buzzard is one that child welfare advocates, law enforcement professionals, and legal analysts have identified as presenting a particular set of investigative and jurisdictional challenges. Challenges that arose directly from the deliberate choice to commit the alleged offense in a remote, multi-state environment far from both the point of origin and any established community connection. The geography was not incidental. Investigators assessed it as a strategic choice. For Melody, who was 9 years old, who had traveled from California to a remote canyon in Utah without any power to alter the course of events that her mother was directing, the landscape of that final journey is now permanently part of her story. State Route 24 in Wayne County, Utah, a road that most travelers pass along while headed toward Capitol Reef National Park or the San Rafael Swell, is where she was found. It is now, in the way that locations associated with criminal cases become, a place that carries a name attached to it, Melody's. The formal accountability for what happened to her is being pursued in California courts. Whatever verdict those proceedings ultimately produce, it will be the legal system's answer to what the investigation documented: a child taken from California, carried across state lines, and lost in the Utah desert. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Melody deserves to be remembered, and your support helps us make sure she is. Case 8. Jessica Lujan, January 31st, 2019, 3rd District Court, Salt Lake County, Utah. The Midvale Motel 6 sits in the urban sprawl of Salt Lake County, a roadside property of the kind that serves a transient population, travelers passing through, families between permanent addresses, individuals navigating the difficult margins of housing insecurity. On the evening of January 31st, 2019, an emergency call came in from that location. First responders were told that an infant was unresponsive. They responded immediately. What they found upon arrival, and what the investigation that followed would document, represents one of the most disturbing cases of domestic violence inflicted upon a child in Salt Lake County's recent criminal record. The infant at the center of this case was 5 months old. 5 months is an age at which a child is entirely dependent, incapable of independent movement, incapable of self-protection, incapable of communicating distress in any way except through crying. A 5-month-old has no capacity to resist harm, no capacity to remove himself from a dangerous situation, no capacity to summon help. He exists entirely within the care framework provided by the adults responsible for him, trusting in the most fundamental and unmediated way that the world immediately around him is safe. First responders arrived at the Motel 6 and found the infant in a critical state. He was transported to a medical facility where emergency care was provided. The medical team's findings and the subsequent medical documentation would become part of the evidentiary record in the criminal case that followed. Jessica Lujan, the child's mother, was present at the scene. In the course of the investigation conducted by Midvale Police and Salt Lake County detectives, she provided a statement. In that statement, according to the court record, she described what had occurred that evening in the motel room in terms that formed the factual basis for the charges subsequently brought against her. The evening had included a significant argument with the infant's father. The argument, by Lujan's own account, had escalated to a point of intense emotional distress. What followed, according to the statement she provided and the charges she ultimately faced, was an act of extreme violence directed at the 5-month-old child, an act of rage displaced from its source onto the only other person in the room, who happened to be an infant incapable of understanding, resisting, or surviving the force applied to him. The charges brought against Jessica Lujan were consistent with the severity of what the medical evidence and her own statement documented: child abuse homicide. The child had not survived. The case proceeded through 3rd District Court in Salt Lake County. Lujan entered a guilty plea to child abuse homicide. Her guilty plea represented the formal acknowledgement of the facts entered into the record, the acknowledgement that what had occurred in that motel room on January 31st, 2019, was not an accident, not a medical event, not a tragedy of the kind that occurs beyond human agency, but the direct consequence of violent acts applied to an infant who was entirely without the capacity to protect himself. The case of Jessica Lujan is one that domestic violence advocates and child welfare professionals have engaged with as an example of a pattern that criminal justice research has documented across decades and jurisdictions. The phenomenon of violence that originates in adult conflict and is redirected toward the most vulnerable and proximate target. It is a pattern that manifests in a range of scenarios: arguments between partners, episodes of severe emotional dysregulation, situations of extreme stress, and whose most devastating iterations involve the infants and young children who are present in spaces where adult conflict occurs. Domestic violence support organizations, hotlines, and crisis counselors exist specifically to intervene in situations of escalating adult conflict before they produce outcomes like the one documented in this case. Their work is not theoretical. It is directly connected to the prevention of the kind of event that occurred at the Midvale Motel 6 on a January night in 2019. The infant whose life ended in that motel room was 5 months old. He had been alive for approximately 150 days. Whatever those days had contained, the ordinary sensations of infancy, the sounds and textures and close presences that constitute the early experience of being alive, ended on January 31st in a motel in Midvale, Utah. The criminal proceeding that followed his death represents the legal system's acknowledgement of what he lost and of who was responsible. Jessica Lujan's guilty plea and subsequent sentencing represent the formal conclusion of the legal process in this case. The accountability established through that process does not reach back to January 31st and alter its outcome. It reaches forward into the record and establishes that what happened was wrong, that the law recognized it as wrong, and that the person responsible was held to account. If you or someone you know is experiencing a domestic crisis, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-SAFE. That is 1-800-799-7233. Help is available. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscription helps us continue this work. Case 9, Carolyn Dawn Hughes, September 3, 2015, 3rd District Court, Salt Lake County, Utah. There is a category of case in the criminal justice record that produces a particular kind of public response. Not the shock of premeditation or the horror of sustained abuse, but something closer to grief at its most bewildering. The loss of a child's life in circumstances where prevention was entirely possible. where the single decision that made everything else inevitable was made by the person most responsible for the child's safety, and where the legal outcome that followed was so disproportionate to the loss that communities struggled to reconcile the sentence with the scale of the tragedy. The case of Carolyn Dawn Hughes and the death of her 3-year-old daughter Paisley Hayden on September 3, 2015, belongs precisely to this category. The intersection of 2700 South and Redwood Road in Salt Lake City is not a quiet rural crossing. It is a major urban intersection in one of Salt Lake City's established residential and commercial neighborhoods, a wide, multi-lane environment with significant traffic volume, traffic signals, and the kind of infrastructure that reflects the demands of a busy city corridor. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of intersection where the consequences of a vehicle collision can be severe. On the morning of September 3, 2015, Carolyn Dawn Hughes was driving a Chevrolet Trailblazer through that intersection. In the vehicle with her were 8 children. The precise arrangement of those children within the vehicle, who was seated where, who was secured, and who was not, became a central element of the investigation and the subsequent criminal proceedings. What the investigation established was that the 3-year-old, Paisley Hayden, was entirely unrestrained. She was not in a car seat. She was not wearing a seatbelt. She was, by the admission of her mother in the criminal proceeding, simply present in the vehicle without the restraints that Utah law requires and that basic child safety practice demands. Hughes attempted a left turn at the intersection. The turn was, in the assessment of the investigating officers and the eventual criminal proceedings, executed in a manner inconsistent with safe driving, a turn that did not account adequately for the traffic conditions and the physics of the vehicle she was operating. Another vehicle struck the Trailblazer. The impact caused the Chevrolet to roll. In the rollover, Paisley Hayden, unrestrained, with no car seat to contain her within the vehicle's occupant space, was ejected. The 3-year-old was thrown from the rolling vehicle. Her injuries from that ejection were fatal. She did not survive. The investigation that followed established not only the circumstances of the collision itself, but a pattern of conduct that gave the individual tragedy a broader and more alarming context. Carolyn Dawn Hughes, in the course of the investigation and the subsequent criminal proceedings, acknowledged that she routinely operated vehicles without securing her children. This was not, by her own account, an oversight on the morning of September 3. It was a consistent practice, a habit, a pattern, a way of doing things that had persisted across a period of time sufficient to constitute a recognized behavioral norm within the household. Hughes was identified in the investigation as a member of the Kingston Group, a polygamous religious organization based in Utah with a significant presence in the Salt Lake Valley. The Kingston Group maintains practices and community structures that differ substantially from mainstream Utah society, including in areas related to family size, domestic authority, and, investigators noted, child safety practices within vehicles. The religious affiliation was not, in the legal proceedings, the cause of what had happened to Paisley, but it provided context for the environment in which the practice of driving with unsecured children had developed and persisted. The charge brought against Carolyn Dawn Hughes was negligent homicide, a charge that, under Utah law, reflects a determination that the conduct causing death fell below the standard of care that a reasonable person would have exercised in similar circumstances, and that this failure caused the victim's death. It is a charge that occupies a different category than the intentional or knowing conduct at issue in other cases in this documentary. It does not require proof that Hughes intended harm. It requires proof that her failure to meet a basic standard of care had a fatal consequence. The legal proceeding resulted in what is known in Utah's criminal justice system as a plea in abeyance, a resolution in which a plea is entered but the conviction is held in suspension pending the defendant's compliance with specified conditions. Hughes served 10 days in jail and was required to meet additional conditions of the agreement. The plea in abeyance resolution meant that, provided she met those conditions, the conviction itself would not remain permanently on her record. That outcome, 10 days in jail for the death of a 3-year-old child, generated significant public response. Community members, child safety advocates, and legal analysts expressed, in various forums, their view that the legal consequence was insufficient relative to the loss. The Salt Lake City community, The broader Salt Lake County public and national audiences who learned of the case through media coverage engaged with the disparity between the sentence and the tragedy in ways that reflected a deep frustration with the limitations of what the negligent homicide statute, as applied to this set of facts, was able to produce. That frustration is not legally cognizable. The plea was entered, the conditions were set, the process followed its course. But it is humanly comprehensible. Paisley Hayden was 3 years old. She was in a vehicle driven by her mother, surrounded by her siblings, on an ordinary morning in Salt Lake City. She was not secured. She was ejected from a rolling vehicle. She did not survive, and the person responsible for the decision not to secure her served 10 days. Child safety advocates pointed to the Paisley Hayden case as a catalyst for renewed attention to car seat enforcement in Utah, particularly within communities where noncompliance had been identified as a pattern rather than an exception. The case contributed to legislative and enforcement discussions about how Utah's child restraint laws are applied and how patterns of noncompliance within specific communities might be addressed. Paisley Hayden was 3 years old. Her name is on a court record in Salt Lake County. It is in the case files of the officers who responded to 2700 South and Redwood Road on September 3, 2015. It is in this documentary. Her name, and the tragedy of her passing, remain part of the public record, a reminder that the decisions adults make about child safety in vehicles are not administrative technicalities, but matters of direct and irreversible consequence. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories matter, and your support helps us tell them. Case 10, Tracey Grist, July 2025, 4th District Court, Utah County, Utah. There is a particular category of family violence that investigators and prosecutors find among the most difficult to prosecute and among the most troubling to confront, not because the violence itself is ambiguous, but because the family dynamics that surround it are so thoroughly distorted by the time law enforcement arrives that reconstruction of what actually happened requires peeling back layers of deception, staging, and coordinated false narrative. The case of Tracey Grist, as it unfolded in American Fork, in Utah County, in the summer of 2025, and as it was finally adjudicated in 4th District Court in Provo, Utah, on April 21, 2026, is precisely this kind of case. Matthew Rastelli was Tracey Grist's son-in-law. The specific nature of the relationship between Rastelli and the Grist family, the precise dynamics, the history, the events that led to the summer of 2025, is part of the evidentiary record that prosecutors presented at trial. What the jury ultimately determined, after hearing the full presentation of that evidence, was that whatever that history contained, it had motivated Tracey Grist to take steps that resulted in Matthew Rastelli losing his life. The prosecution's theory of the case, as presented to the 4th District Court jury in Provo, was one of premeditated planning. According to the evidence presented at trial, Grist had organized the events of the day with significant forethought. She had cleaned her home in advance, a specific and deliberate preparation, investigators argued, designed to minimize the physical evidence that a violent incident would otherwise leave behind. The goal, in the prosecution's framing, was to control the crime scene from the outset, to shape the physical environment of the location before the event occurred in a manner that would serve the narrative to be constructed afterward. The narrative to be constructed afterward was self-defense. Matthew Rastelli was lured to the Grist residence. The manner in which he was brought to that location, the communications, the representations made to him, the circumstances under which he arrived at a home where, according to prosecutors, his death had been arranged in advance, was documented in the trial record. Once Rastelli was present at the property, Tracey Grist's son was the one who shot him. The physical act of the killing was carried out not by Grist herself, but by a family member acting, prosecutors argued, as part of a coordinated plan in which Grist was the architect. What followed the shooting, according to the evidence presented at trial, was the implementation of the scene staging strategy that had been prepared in advance. The physical environment of the Grist home was presented to first responders and, subsequently, investigators as consistent with a self-defense scenario, the kind of situation in which a family, confronted with an intruder or a threatening individual, had acted to protect themselves. The staging, however, was not adequate to withstand the scrutiny of the investigation that followed. Law enforcement investigators examined the scene with the kind of careful forensic attention that is applied in any suspected homicide investigation. The physical evidence they documented, the nature and pattern of what was present and, crucially, what was conspicuously absent, told a story that was inconsistent with the self-defense narrative being offered. The advanced cleaning, the staged physical environment, the specific evidence of preparation that investigators identified, these elements built the evidentiary foundation for the prosecution's case. The trial in 4th District Court in Provo proceeded across the course of the scheduled proceedings. The jury heard testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, witnesses with knowledge of the relationships and events at issue, and the full evidentiary picture that the investigation had assembled. They deliberated. On April 21, 2026, they returned their verdict, guilty on all counts, including murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The conviction of Tracey Grist on those charges represents the legal conclusion of a proceeding that began in the summer of 2025 with a shooting that was presented as self-defense and that the investigation demonstrated was, in the prosecution's established case, something fundamentally different. The jury's verdict represents their determination that the evidence, considered in its totality, was sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on both the murder charge and the conspiracy charge, the latter of which directly addressed the prosecution's theory that the planning and coordination involved in the events constituted a crime in its own right, separate from the physical act of the shooting. Matthew Rastelli was a son-in-law, a husband, a member of a family network that now carries the weight of a loss inflicted not by a stranger or an external threat, but by people connected to him through the bonds of family. The particular anguish of family violence, the violence that occurs not between enemies or strangers, but between people who share a surname, a history, a table at holiday gatherings, is one that victim advocates and grief counselors who work in this space describe as among the most difficult forms of loss to navigate. There is no clean separation between grief and anger when the person responsible is also a family member. There is no simple reconstruction of an identity as a survivor when the community of support that ordinarily surrounds survivors is itself divided by the same event. For the broader community of American Fork in Utah County, the trial of Tracey Grist produced a verdict that the legal process requires, a formal determination of guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented in open court. The jury's unanimous verdict provided that determination. Whether sentencing has occurred by the time of this documentary's production, or whether Grist awaits a sentencing hearing scheduled in the weeks or months following the April 21, 2026 verdict, the direction of the legal outcome has been established by the jury's findings. The case of Tracey Grist stands, within the broader landscape of serious criminal cases in Utah, as an example of how the investigation of family violence requires more than the physical evidence of a single event. It requires the patient reconstruction of what came before, the planning, the preparation, the coordination, the communications, and the willingness to look past a stage scene to the evidence that staging could not fully conceal. In this case, that investigation produced a prosecution, and that prosecution produced a conviction. Matthew Rastelli is gone. His family carries that loss. The trial record contains the formal account of what the evidence showed about why. That account, and the verdict it produced, represent what the legal system can offer in response to a loss of this kind: accountability, a documented record, and the determination that what happened was a crime and that the person who planned it has been found responsible. The Utah Victim Services Division and the Homicide Survivors Organization provide ongoing support to families who have lost loved ones to violence. Their work continues long after the verdicts are returned, accompanying the people most affected by these cases through the years of rebuilding that follow the legal proceedings. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour from the very beginning of this documentary to this final case. These 10 cases represent 10 different stories, 10 different families, 10 different communities that were permanently altered by what the women at the center of each account chose to do, or, in some cases, failed to choose not to do. Behind every case in this documentary is a victim whose absence is the defining fact of the story. A 3-year-old at an intersection in Salt Lake City, a 4-year-old in a West Valley City basement on New Year's Eve, a 5-month-old in a Midvale motel room, a 6-year-old at Primary Children's Hospital, a 9-year-old found in a Utah canyon, an 18-month-old pulled from a retention pond. Behind every case is a family that woke up one day and entered a world permanently rearranged by loss. This documentary exists to ensure that these victims are not reduced to case numbers or file references, that the details of what happened to them are preserved in the record of public attention, that the legal proceedings that followed their harm are understood as the institutional response to something that mattered enormously, and that the communities that were shaped by these events continue to carry them forward in the ongoing work of building support systems, intervention resources, and accountability frameworks that might, in some future case, in some other household, in some community somewhere, intervene before another tragedy becomes irreversible. If this documentary has raised any concerns for you about a child in your community, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. The call is confidential. The concern is always worth making. Please like this video, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on these cases and the justice system's response to them, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if you haven't already. Your engagement with this content is what allows this channel to continue doing this work. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and thank you for watching.